Well, thanks again for coming, and it's an honor to introduce Joel Kotkin. And you have his bio in front of you, but I love this, described by New York Times as America's Uber geographer. I think of him more as a demographer, having been a past demographer. If you don't have a chance, or if you haven't had a chance, I just drove down from Idaho Falls, and I spent 3 hours listening to his podcast. And he has a great podcast, really interesting, goes into a lot of different topics, whether it's on urban development or on international politics, or I just listened to one on artificial intelligence. Joel, remind me the name. Feudal Future. So check out your podcast. And you said one's dropping today, right?
Yeah.
So, but Joel is a very compelling speaker. His latest book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class. So check out his book as well. He's the Roger Hobbs Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University in Orange, California. Please join me in welcoming Joel Kotkin.
I'm going to try to do this fast enough so that we can get some Q&A going, because we actually have fairly limited time. Now, some of you may have originally thought that this was going to be about feudalism, but maybe you could call this fundamentals of feudalism, because really it's demographics that really drive all this. So, but I'm going to start off with something I think is very congruent with what's happened at the summit. The decline in families and birth rate, we've been working on this, my colleague Wendell Cox and I, for about 20, 25 years. We came up with a term called post-familialism, which we did while we were doing a study for the government of Singapore. They were trying to figure out, how come Singapore's doing great, why isn't anyone having children? And just to give you an idea what a problem it was, we had a meeting with Singaporean women in a pub, and the government was there, and they kept saying, what happens if we gave you $100,000? And when they got to $1 million, nothing was going to happen. They gave up. So this whole question is not just in America. Actually, we're in somewhat better shape, not terrific shape, from other places. But it's the big challenge of the future is going to be not population explosion, but population implosion. And I'll discuss that. Then the other thing is, where are people moving? And you know, I've had a lot of discussions with people here about your downtown and your, you know, the idea that you're going to have all these, you know, these bright young millennials and Xers, you know, piling into downtown Salt Lake. Well, if they're there, they're certainly not that present. And the people who are going to shape our future, and this again is congruent with what we've been doing at the conference, is going to be particularly people with children, and that's going to be very heavily immigrants. Immigrants have somewhat higher birth rates. By the way, not impossible birth rates. I mean, it's, you know, when I talk to people, you know, when you talk to people even here in Utah, you know, still people who are from families of 8 to 10, well, that's become pretty rare. Diversity, I think this is going to be a huge driver, and even here in Utah. And actually, one of the things we'll talk about is how immigrants are actually moving to states like Utah and not to states like California. Like, remarkably, during this whole migrant crisis, California has actually been affected less than the rest of the country. I think basically the word came out, California's too expensive, too hard to make a living, so we're going to go someplace else like Salt Lake City. Diversity is spreading. This is really interesting. I think, you know, when President Bush was talking about, you know, the need for a sort of another turning about what's going on in this country and the gaps between Americans, and it's very often you'll get the sense, well, there's white America and then there's the minority America. Actually, the minority America is spreading very, very rapidly, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I think we're going to have a very different future than what we've predicted. Now, this is really important. I know it may be a little hard to read, but I'm more than happy to share the slides. We, those of us, I'm probably older than most of you, but if you remember the population bomb from Paul Ehrlich, and that was probably the most important environmental book of the last 50 years. And what Ehrlich was saying is, you know, if you read the book, it's really, you know, his specialty is insects. And he was talking about how people were reproducing like insects. And he has descriptions of India that are, you know, just horrific and I think pretty inhuman. But what his thesis was that by 2000, there wouldn't be enough food to feed England and that we'd be going through massive starvation. Frankly, that didn't happen. Agriculture became more proficient, and we have a bigger problem, at least in the high-income world, with eating too much than not having enough to eat. But what we're seeing is we really are not quite sure. Some people believe that by 2040, the world population will start to drop. It will drop much more quickly. I'll show you some really remarkable statistics. But what you're seeing is that the predictions that are still going to be coming, you know, you go to any environmental conference, well, we'll have 10 billion people by next week. Not happening. You know, because what's happening in the developing world, women are getting educated, they're moving to cities, space is expensive, so they're not going to have, you know, when people tell me, oh, Nigeria is going to have 500 million people, I'll take that bet. Problem is I'll be dead by the time I could collect on it. Because, like I remember in the past, we were thinking Mexico is going to have 250 million people because people projected that things wouldn't change. But Mexico, like every place else, is changing. Women are getting educated, people are moving into cities, young people have different attitudes. So this is the biggest driver in the next 50 years. I think more important than climate change or anything is going to be the change in the nature of the human population. Here's one I think that's really worth talking about, you know, because we talked a lot about China, and I think it was brought up briefly the other day. China is going to see, by 2100, a decline in its 15 to 19 population of about 40%. China has a very severe shortage of young people. Now, some of it was a product of the one-child policy, but once they got rid of the one-child policy, it really didn't make a difference. And so I was in Beijing right before the pandemic, and I did a little focus group with young Chinese women. I always figure, like, in the birth rate area, you know, the cards are mostly women. You can see what's happening is that China is actually losing its youthful population at an incredibly rapid rate. And this is happening throughout all of Southeast Asia. The lowest birth rates in the world are either in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, and one of the issues for the Ukraine, interestingly enough, is they're running out of people. They have an extraordinarily low birth rate. Same thing is true in Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Hong Kong has probably the lowest birth rate in the world. So what you're going to see is a loss, and on a global level, the 15 to 19 population will be dropping. I think it will drop much more than this. The 2020 is much more, shows a much stronger decline. And now, we're not perfect. You know, Americans have some of the same things. We've had a very sharp decline in fertility. Even here in Utah, the families of 8 to 10 that were common when I first started doing stories here in 1980, that's no longer the case. I mean, people say they have 3 kids, 4 kids. Increasingly, many people are not having kids. The new projections are that about 25 to 30% of all women by 2030 will be 40, and who are 40 years old will not have kids. They will have never had kids. So this is a huge sociological change and economic change. The US is better off than some other countries, as you can see. The only high-income country in the world with a high birth rate is Israel. And you don't want to ask me why. I can give you a long discussion, which you probably don't have time for. But as you can see, you look at places like Denmark, Finland, and this is what's really interesting. These are some of the most successful countries in the world, with enormous welfare states, with all sorts of incentive. But as my friends in Singapore found out, if people don't want to have kids, they're not giving them money isn't going to make a difference. It's going to be something else that's going to make them have kids, and I don't think it's going to be the government. Now, the big problem that we're going to see, and again, these numbers may not be exactly what we could do if we use the newest numbers, but you can see the workforce in Korea is going to go down 30% by 2050, so that's not that far from now. China's 10%. Actually, I think it will be much more like 20 or 30. The U.S. we will still have labor force growth, again, mostly because of immigration. Also, as I'll get into later, because we're a very big country and there's land and there's lots of places to go where you can live affordably, and where you can still make work. You know, when you go to the United Kingdom, if you don't live in the southeastern corner of the United Kingdom, there's really, as one MP said to me, it's, you know, there's Southeast England and then there's Russia. I mean, that the rest of England is just not a place where people particularly want to go. So I think what you're going to see over time is that the U.S. will still be in the better position, particularly if we begin to create the kinds of environments people want to have children in. And again, that's been one of Utah's strengths. The actuarial issue, which is kind of a depressing one, which is the number, basically what we have is the current numbers is how many people are working for the percentage of people who are retired. And so you can see China in 2000 was about 0.12. By 2050, it'll be 45. Some countries like Japan, there will almost be more people who are retired than people who are working. In Japan, and I think it will probably be true in some of the other East Asian countries, we will probably hit a point where the population of people over 80 will be bigger than people under 15. So just try to imagine. This is what I spend time thinking about. What type of societies are we going to see? Have any of you been to Japan recently? You don't notice a lot of kids on the streets. You know, same thing's true if you go to Germany. Not a lot of kids in the streets. If you're going to see in Germany, they're probably going to be immigrants. So the birth rates are going to create enormous financial pressure for things like Social Security, because there just aren't going to be enough people paying in. So here's the reality. Economic growth in the future will favor smaller places, less regulated states. And I have the numbers for that. The radical impact of remote and hybrid work. This is something that I think people in Utah in particular should be thinking about, is maybe the future of Utah is not building up a lot of high-rise residential in downtown Salt Lake City. Maybe it's creating new sustainable communities in the vast Utah County and the other surrounding counties. That's where almost all the growth in the U.S. is taking place. Now, it used to be said, well, the millennials, they don't want to live in the city. They want to be hip and cool and live in Greenwich Village. The reality is something happened to the millennials. They got older. They got to 30. They thought about getting married. They thought about maybe they want to buy a house. Maybe they want to have a backyard for the kids, or maybe even just for a dog. And this trend of millennials to suburbs, I have fought this fight for 40 years. I know I'm right because the numbers are right. But I think there has been kind of an attempt in parts of the financial community and parts of the political community to think, well, actually, people really want to live in the dense urban environment. And you know what? That percentage has been about 10% for about 50 years. Then I think one of the big things and one of the great opportunities for a place like Utah is that diversity is spreading. When I first came to Los Angeles in 1971, it was still a city that was predominantly an Anglo city with a significant African American population. Today, it is a Latino city. 40% of the people in the state of California are Latino. 50% of people under the age of 20 are Latino. So this is how our societies will be evolving. Now, what's happening is many of the Latinos either are emigrating, and I'll show you some numbers, are emigrating to places you wouldn't have thought they would emigrate to, and they're not coming to places like Los Angeles for a whole variety of reasons. So the best way for the U.S. to be competitive in the world is to keep some sort of birth rate and build our labor force economically in terms of paying pensions. If we go the way that Europe is going and East Asia, I think we'll be in big trouble. So here's what America looks like today. We do it by density. So basically, the higher density suburban, you can see the lower density. Look at the urban core, which is not just downtown, is about 4.2% of the population. I mean, that's the reality of it. And yet, part of the problem is that newspapers and TV stations are located in the central city, and so everything becomes a big deal. You know, if I'm working for the Los Angeles Times and I can do a story on some big urban development 10 minutes from the office, that's great. Going and driving to Riverside, San Bernardino is not so much fun, so they don't do it. But this is what's happening. And here's the migration pattern. And again, you can see there was one period right after the financial crisis where the urban core counties were gaining almost as much as the suburbs, and you can see what's happened since. So we have this huge movement of population away from the urban core. And remember, urban core counties can be like if you take the counties of Los Angeles, even though it's got a downtown and has been around for a while, actually much of it is still single-family homes and predominantly suburban. So this even underestimates how extreme this is. So we take a look at migration. And as you can see, from 2011 to 2022, the major urban core counties lost 2.7 million people. The suburbs gained 2 million. One very interesting change that nobody's really paying attention to, and we were shocked, we didn't expect to see this, is people moving to small towns and rural areas. We never thought that was happening. We thought the rural area, like I just reviewed a book called Rural Rage. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. And they're saying, well, rural America's dying, everyone's leaving. Well, actually, I've traveled quite a bit, and these numbers show me that people are beginning to say, hey, I can live in a small town or a smaller city. Now, obviously, from 2021 to 2023, this was accelerated. So, but the pattern was there before the pandemic. And again, you can see the big change more recently has been outside of the big metro areas. And again, this is a revolutionary change, and it's going to be very important in the future of Utah, because you may think all the population is going to cluster in Salt Lake City. I think the population is going to continue to disperse, and it's going to find a home in many of your small towns, many of which were depopulating for quite a long time. I mean, oddly enough, for instance, some of the fastest growth in population in the United States and one of the highest birth rates is in North Dakota. So it tells you something. Now, if we look by density, again, basically people are moving from 2010 to 2020, again, to lower density suburbs. Now, here's Salt Lake City. From 1950, in 1950, Salt Lake City had 182,000 people. The suburbs, the balance of the metropolitan area, which would include Utah County, was 93,000. So Salt Lake was definitely the center of everything. In 2022, Salt Lake has grown to about 200,000. Some of that is because there were some annexations. The suburban periphery grew by almost 1 million. I don't know. It's like you got to watch what people are doing with their feet. Don't necessarily listen to what the New York Times is telling you, or what NPR is telling you, or even the Wall Street Journal is telling you. Take a look at the actual numbers, and it's pretty clear that the future of Salt Lake is going to be a much more dispersed one. Now, in terms of employment, again, what we can see in the last 5 years is the most rapid growth in jobs is taking place in the suburban areas. The higher density suburbs would be the ones maybe within a half hour, 40 minutes of downtown. And as you can see, the urban core has actually created rather few jobs. And this is to 2022. And when we asked investors where do they want to locate future plants, again, overwhelmingly suburban areas. Actually, more of them for mid-sized urban areas and rural areas than urban areas. And part of the problem is urban areas have become ungovernable, particularly in the Northeast, in California. They have bad school systems. I mean, I can tell you, my wife and I, we moved from Los Angeles, where I had lived for 40 years, to Orange County because, you know what, I sort of liked the idea of my younger daughter going to public school. I didn't feel like spending $50,000 a year on a private school. Plus, I think the exposure in the public school, she made friends who were different races and different backgrounds. But what's really interesting to me is that what we're seeing is a very powerful movement, both economically and also in terms of population. These things are happening together. So where are millennials leaving? The cities they're leaving since 2021, New York, Chicago, Washington, Boston, LA, San Francisco, and where they're coming, Austin, Denver. Now I think Denver, is going to start to decline, but we can talk about that later. Dallas, Raleigh. These were not places that were thought to be places that young people wanted to go. Jacksonville, Florida, Henderson, Nevada, which is not too far from Vegas, and this place called Salt Lake City. So now when we say Salt Lake City, we're not saying the city of Salt Lake City, we're saying the Salt Lake area. And I think try to think about it this way. I'm a young couple, I've got a good job, we've got 2 incomes, maybe making $100,000, $150,000 a year. They want to buy a house. I'm going to tell you, $150,000 a year, you're not going to buy a house in Southern California. A house in Southern California is going to run you about $1 million. And then if you want to find a good school district you're getting close to $1.5 million. So what they're doing is they're looking for other places. Now what's happening here in Salt Lake, from everything I'm hearing from people, is your prices are starting to get really high, which means that people are going to look for alternative locations to Salt Lake. And when we looked at migration out of California, the biggest group leaving was 35 to 54, making $100,000 a year. That's the group that was leaving. It used to be the poor left and some of the crotchety old people left. But now it's actually young people at the height of their career years and who may be likely to have children. Now, many people say, millennials, they're not interested in home ownership. As you can see from these surveys, actually they're interested in home ownership about as much as their parents were. The group that, as you can see, Gen Xers, boomers are actually somewhat less because they already passed that phase of their lives. But as you can see, millennials want to own a home. I mean, and there was an enormous campaign from various people saying, they want to be renters. Well, you know why? One of the reasons they want to be renters, why they push this idea, is so I'm an investment bank. I'd much rather have you as a renter paying rent for the rest of your life than you actually accumulating any capital of your own. I mean, one of the key ideas of neo-feudalism is you wipe out the property-owning middle class, and everybody becomes a permanent renter. And if you ever heard of this idea of the rentership society, where actually you would rent your furniture, you would rent everything. Well, at the end of the day, when you're 60 years old, what are you going to retire on? Doesn't seem like it's going to work out too well. And at the same time, the investment banking community will be making money on those rents. I think it's an absolute disaster for democracy. America was built on the idea of small proprietors, upward mobility. You take that away, and you really don't have any basis for democracy. One of the things I looked at is home ownership by age, and I use California as an example of what happens when you let your housing market get completely messed up. If you look at 85 and over, California is about where everybody else is. You get to 75 to 84, there's a difference, but it's not that big. 65 to 74, not that big. Look at 45 to 54, but particularly 35 to 44 and 25 to 34. So that means that young people, if they want to go forward in their lives and they want to buy a house, they're not likely to do it in California. They're going to go someplace else. Now, I want to talk a little briefly about the impact of hybrid work. I think is going to accelerate this. The nonstop campaign by some of the big corporations saying, oh, everyone's going to go back to the office. Well, the most recent numbers are office attendance has actually declined in the past year. People getting used to not having to go 5 days a week. Now, I think hybrid is going to be there, but I think a lot of people are also going to work remote permanently. Again, hybrid is about 30%. So you're going to take almost 40% of the workforce is not going to be in the office every day. And of course, it's had catastrophic effects on downtowns because they rely on the commuters coming every day, and if they're not there, they've lost a lot of their commuters. It's one of the things is like when you're building all these buildings here in Salt Lake, the assumption is, well, these people are working in businesses downtown. But if the businesses are operating somewhere else, then what's the advantage? And as we can see, the percentage of people who could work at home is about 45% part-time and about 15 to 20% full-time. So that's going to have a huge marginal effect. Worked at home, you can see again. Now, during the pandemic, it went much higher, but you can see the 2023 number is much, much bigger than the 2020 number. So remote work, hybrid work is, I think, part of the system now. And I think also for many companies, once their leases are up, they're going to say, I don't think I need to have this much space. And people are rethinking their real estate. And by the way, if anything is going to precipitate a recession, it will be the collapse of office and particularly in the big cities. The amount of money that's being lost right now in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, on the valuations of all. I read all the time, this building was sold for 1/5 of what its price was, 1/2 of what its price was. So there are going to be very significant haircuts. And what we trace here is where the jobs have been going. And again, core cities have lost, the 8 most transit-oriented core cities have lost about 1 million. The suburban areas around those areas have gained almost 900,000, and the rest of the country has gained about 3.7 million. One of the big things, and this ties up to the global picture, is children. Basically, anywhere you go in the world, high density means low birth rate. And that's one of the reasons why I think many of the projections of developing countries gaining population, as they urbanize, their birth rates are going to drop dramatically, as has already occurred in Mexico. So as you can see, people are much more likely to have children at a lower density than they would in a higher density. Now, just briefly, obviously one part of the population that's going to be growing is, well, in Yiddish we would call them alte kakas. I won't translate it for you because it's a family event, but basically just say a lot of old people. And you can see the numbers of old people going from, let's say, 2030, 72 million to 88 million in 2050. When people made it to 60, 65, 70, that was old when I was growing up. And now it's not unfamiliar to have somebody who's in their 80s, 90s. And look, they can run for president, right? The senior population, one of the great myths that the New York Times and others I like to pick on them. I used to work for them, so I like picking on them sometimes. The senior population, they said, oh, the seniors, they're all going to move back to the city because it's so much more fun. First of all, I can tell you, even I'm not that old, I think it would be very difficult in your 70s and 80s to live in a big city unless you had an enormous amount of money. In a particular city like New York, where you're walking all the time, where you're exposed all the time, where are they moving? They're moving to the suburbs and the exurbs. That's where the big population growth of older people is happening. Also, as older people they may not want to drive. They are very concerned about their security. And historically, one of the arguments was they would stay in the city because of the medical services. But now, if you notice, many hospitals are now building in the suburbs at a fairly massive level. For instance, if you take the Texas Medical Center, which is in Houston, the largest medical center in the world, they're building another one out in Beltway 8, which is going to be the same thing. And I asked the guy who's developing it, and he said, you know what, the doctors live out here anyway. So that's going to be a change. And then I want to talk about, I think, one of the more important topics, which is, our think tank, we just did a big study on the future of the Latino population in California, which, if you want, we can send to you. But you look at the suburbs today, the idea was the suburbs is where the white people go, and that's where they run away from people of color. If you look at growth in the suburbs in the last 20 years, Hispanics were 51%, Asians were 20%, African Americans were 20%. The white non-Hispanics were 4% of all the growth in the suburbs. I mean, what we forget about is, people, whatever their background, they have the same aspirations. They want to own a house, they want to be a place that's safe, and they want to have good schools. And so what we're seeing is like some amazing areas, like the most diverse county in the United States is Fort Bend County, Texas, about 30 miles from the city of Houston, but very developed. And it's literally a quarter Asian, a quarter Hispanic, a quarter African American, and a quarter white. You want to see the future of America, go there. Then if we take a look at where people live, yes, whites still are more likely to live in suburbs, but 70% of African Americans, 80% of Asians, 80% of Hispanics all live in suburban areas. So this notion that suburbs, which initially may have been areas that were restrictive. I mean, the suburb I live in Orange County, I couldn't have moved into 40 years ago because I'm the wrong religion. That's just gone. I mean, we had a menorah lighting in our town center, and there must have been 200 people there. So what you're seeing is that the suburbs are actually, in many cases, now more diverse than the cities. If you go, let's say, to Dallas, for instance, large Asian populations, Hispanic populations, concentrated predominantly in the suburban areas. Now, this is, I think, one of the more shocking things. We asked the question, where have the foreign-born gone? This is different than just immigration, because people usually immigrate to what we would call the places that people come in initially, like New York, L.A., San Francisco. But then we traced where do they actually settle, and the number one, it's not on this list. Number one was Miami. It was basically Miami, Dallas, and Houston were growing the fastest. Los Angeles actually lost foreign-born population in the last decade. Because you know what? People aren't stupid. Schools are bad, traffic's terrible, there's high crime. Maybe I'll go someplace else if I can get away with it. And then the issue of home ownership. You take a look at the home ownership rates of, for instance, Hispanics, 24% in the urban core, 50% in the suburbs. African Americans, 31% in the core, 44% in the suburbs. I'm greatly convinced that people really generally want the same things. And they change sometimes by over age, but they basically want to own a home, and basically they're going to go to those places where they feel most comfortable and where they have the opportunity. Now we take a look at Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City's still pretty white compared to a lot of places. But it's changing. You can see the white non-Hispanic population from 2010 to 2022 went from 75% to 68%. Remember, there's been a lot of population growth, so the minority populations have grown. The Hispanic population, I think, is where I think you're going to see a lot of growth, because as you begin to grow and you create jobs, the Hispanic population is going to grow dramatically. I was working on this in Tennessee, and Nashville will have a Hispanic plurality by 2030. You know, country music. So what we need to do is just have a new approach on policy, bias against the suburbs, which is so deeply entrenched in our media, in our financial community, and most particularly in academia, that we really have to stop that. There is a conflict between what most people want and what the government wants them to do. Most jobs are going to move to the suburbs, and so we have to figure out how to make those more sustainable. And so in some of the reports we've done, we talked about, for instance, you take the city of Irvine. Some of you might be familiar with it. The city of Irvine has the shortest commutes and the highest percentage of people who work at home. And if you go to Irvine, if you live in Irvine, there's a very high chance that you work in Irvine, you shop in Irvine. So in many ways, there are models that can be made. Plus, some of these newer developments that I've seen, they have parklands. About a third of Irvine is parkland. They have parkland. They're building concert venues. They're building art museums. So the world is changing, and I think we have to start thinking about these suburban and exurban communities as places where we could create a sustainable and more interesting future than is usually assumed. The big problem, and you have this in Utah, it's one of the reasons why you've got the high prices, is the idea of urban containment, that you want to push everybody towards the core, and you're going to penalize people who want to go outside. And what we find is that tends to raise prices. It also doesn't, eventually even developers occasionally have some intelligence, and they begin to realize that states with those kind of policies create relatively small amounts of housing. You can see, look at California. We're like at a third of what states like Texas are. We're not building enough housing. Since we don't build enough housing, the price of the housing we have is gone up. And sometimes I even think about the fact that when Jerry Brown was governor, since I know Jerry, I was thinking, you know, we used to say to my wife, well, you know what, we ought to send him a Christmas card thanking him for making our house more valuable. Because these policies, that's exactly what's going to happen. You know, it's just a basic law of economics. So what we need to do is think about how we can develop our suburban areas in a more sustainable way. That is something that is a great challenge. I've seen people who have done a great job with this. The Woodlands in Houston is a great example. But the idea that we're going to force everybody, for instance, to deal with climate change, we're going to force everybody downtown, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. People don't want it. What you do is you end up chasing them from one area to another area, because what people's desires are have not changed all that much. And what my idea is that the long term is a friend of mine came up with the term archipelago of villages, that Americans are actually villagers. That's their natural state. They want to be in a place that they know, where they know people, where they go to church, where there's a place that they can identify with, where there's shopping, where there's recreation. And increasingly what you'll find is they're going to find this in these suburban areas. And of course people say, well, we don't have any room for that. Well, this is just to give you an idea how much rural land we have relative to urban land. You know, it's like I had a good friend who unfortunately passed away from Nebraska, and every time he heard people say, well, there's no room in this country, he said, I have this temptation to push somebody out of the plane somewhere, you know, as we're flying over Nebraska, if you don't think that we have enough room as a country. And at the end, I think the idea is it's not a question of anti-city or pro-city. Is Frank Lloyd Wright, I think one of the great minds, said, after all is said and done, the citizen, is really the city. And we can, the history of the United States is creating new places. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the history of Salt Lake City. This was an area that was on the fringe of civilization, that had, was basically almost completely underdeveloped. There was a Native American population that was relatively small, and look what Salt Lake City created. That's the future of America, is to recreate what you did in Salt Lake City, but to recreate it in more places. And just to tie it in with the old theme, I think if we do that, we don't become a feudal country, we remain a country of opportunity. So I don't know how much time I've got left, but.
Well, great. Please join me in thanking Joel for this great. And we do have another about 5 minutes for Q&A, and I've got a few, but great, perfect.
They said that you should have them.
Oh, I can run the mic.
Oh, okay. Well, I have skills.
I know, this is my job.
Thank you. That was really insightful presentation. I'm curious, there's a big difference in terms of even attaching birth rate, population expansion, home ownership to financial health. And it's one of the things that wasn't really covered. I mean, the U.S. is a highly indebted society. Housing ownership is driving them towards that, all of these various things. And I'm kind of curious where that fits in your model.
That very, very good question. Here's the reality. Families that own houses have about somewhere over 30, 40% more net worth than those that don't. If you've been paying rent, you might as well just put it down in the toilet because you're never going to see it again. So yes, we are an indebted country, but if you have the patience and you own a house, like I was thinking, my mother, my wife's mother, that house is what paid for a nice retirement for them. People who don't have anything to sell are going to be completely dependent on the government or on the stock market. I don't know which is worse. I mean, we are we do have a debt problem, but I don't think for the individual household, the choice not to own a house is going to work out very well, particularly when you get older. And I think about what I'm going to leave for my children. The fact that we own a house is something that I can give to them that will be of extraordinary value, particularly where it is. So I think that if we look at the long-term financial health of families, homeownership still makes sense. Now, you can go too far. You can buy a too expensive house in a too expensive area and not have the money, as we saw in 2008. Now, right now, obviously, we don't have those sort of mortgages that we had before. So, but I think that every indication, if you read the Habitat for Humanity material, people who own homes are much better off than people who don't. It's the biggest reason, by the way, for the racial disparity in assets. It comes from home ownership.
Great. Other questions?
So I'm a commissioner in Utah County, and we currently issue 5 birth certificates for every 1 death certificate that we issue. But even with that said, over 50% of our growth is coming from people moving in. So we have a decent birth rate, but we still have that moving in. When we look at home ownership, though, the only areas of our county that really have land to develop don't have jobs.
Right.
So, I mean, what would your suggestions on that be?
Well, I think there are some. First of all, I think jobs are moving out, and of course, there's also a portion of the population that can work more remotely, and so that would be a solution. But when you think about development, like if you're developing, let's say, in a more developed part of Salt Lake County, that means that everything in that 20-mile radius, which might be not have jobs, all of a sudden becomes viable. But there's no question. I mean, your demographic is so different. When I look at there are states in this country where more people die than are born. So if I was going to bet on which areas are going to do well, I would rather have your problem than the problems I see in many places. By the way, particularly our large cities.
Yeah, over here.
What do you see happening in a city like LA with all these high rises and businesses moving out? Ultimately, what happens? The value goes down in those buildings, but what are they going to do with them? People are not interested in going back in there for a long time.
Well, I mean, if you're going to talk about, first of all, downtown Los Angeles is a just total disaster. And nobody wants to admit it, nobody wants to talk about it, but all you got to do is look at the numbers. There's when we went to Staples, there was this gigantic Chinese-built high-rise right across the street from Staples, where the Lakers play. And now it's all filled with graffiti. And now it's been taken over by another company. Some of that housing is going to end up, I think, as we're beginning to see, it's going to end up as public housing. I don't see how you can justify forever maintaining buildings that are too expensive, that people don't want. That probably is where we're going to end up with some of that. The problem that Los Angeles has is our economy doesn't generate enough jobs. And 80 to 90% of the jobs we generate are under $50,000 a year. And there's no way you can afford even to pay rent. So we have the most rent afflicted and high and most crowded of any major metropolitan area. So I think LA has got a very difficult future. The other question is that people say, well, what about the office buildings being converted? And what I've been told by people who do it is the older buildings, like some of your older buildings here, probably could be converted because they have high ceilings and they have windows that open. But the modern high-rise is very, very, very difficult to convert to residential. And so, in Los Angeles, the one area in downtown that has done relatively well is what we all call the Bank District, which was a bunch of Beaux-Arts buildings, which are actually quite beautiful on Main and Spring, and those were able to be converted. But how you convert, the old United California Bank Tower is beyond my comprehension.
Well, we're just about out of time, but once again, thank you so much,
you.
Joel.